just want to get a sense of what is it performivity?
Performativity.
Performativity. How would you define it? I want to get a context of where you all are coming from and have it be more of a conversation. How would you define performativity to me? Anyone want to jump in? Not feeling shy? Otherwise I can just like,
I can say something.
what is performativity?
Nice to meet you.
Right, please.
It's, I think it's an exploration of the self and different elements as well as space, what our self can create in a certain space.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also about studying other performers and also the concept of performance in a general, because I think performance is not acting, it's not theater, it's different than that. And we are here to explore this world, I would say.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Would you say it's more on the improv side than the highly scripted and rehearsed side?
I think you can.
Or either?
I think it depends on the project. Like if some are more improvised and some like have a storyline. I feel like also with what Coco was saying, it's also like what story you want to tell through your body or through your performance, and like what do you want to say in a different way that is very performative, and that also like performance can be a great number of things that even like we do day to day, like how we act and everything is also a performance in itself.
So is that something that bleeds out of the
It
performance
bleeds,
space?
it bleeds
or the
out of
theater?
like a theater stage that also like brings back to what
That's great. So it can get into social norms or how we behave in public or different roles or identities we play in different situations. Okay, that's great. That's a very cool class. What types of performance do people do? Are musicians, actors, use movement or dance, voice, any of those?
All.
Great. So most people are multidisciplinary, or there's some people who really focus on a specific?
I mean, we can pull from very different backgrounds. So it's with performers who is more like on the technique side, and we're here to explore what fits for us in a way.
Awesome.
Yeah, because performance can also belong to the technical side or to.
Exactly.
Yeah, we can also collaborate with other types of performance or other types of performers and just focus in one thing or be more, have a wider spectrum.
Got it. Great.
Are you trying
please.
to get a sense of what the class is about, or in general what is performativity and what are practices?
The class, yeah.
The class is about.
Yeah.
Cool. Then in that case, from like my perspective, I think to answer your question about multidisciplinary performances or not, at least from my perspective, I think a lot of us have our strengths, and I think this class is more about kind of seeing where else you can go
Awesome.
with that.
Great.
At least for me, it's been that.
Yes,
I
it's
think
like
about-
pushing yourself into
Yeah,
other ways of expressing.
outside of just your comfort zone or where you thrive.
That's great. It's very similar to the program I was in last year, and then the guest we have here from IMA. So it's interactive media arts, and it's taking, our parents and like people in our lives are like, "What are you doing?" Maybe y'all get that too. But
And we also have two guests from a photography program.
oh, great. Do you want to say which two are?
Known.
No, not you. These two from photography. Wonderful. Great. And do you see performance in photography, or is that more on the documentation side that we'll be talking about?
So for me, like as you asked, what is performativity is a communication language.
Yeah.
So as a visual artist, I'm interested how can we combine like photography with material and with a performance, because photography it's about capturing the moment, right? And performance is about like this prolonged moment, prolongation of the moment. So for me, it's interesting to see how those like two different languages can collide together.
A little, I mean, somewhat different for me, but as like primarily through my background and training and experience, I'm actually mostly a dancer. Also done other types of performance work, but am currently, sorry, I'm normally much more eloquent than this.
I haven't had coffee yet today either, so.
I had the first one, but it's usually like up to the second one that I
Totally.
start functioning again.
I've had some too.
But yeah, am now kind of honing in more on the photography because I did have done and am doing a lot of photography of bodies, not just dancers, but like bodies in general. And my definition of what is dance and performance has really broadened over the last few years, and like a photo of anything could be a photo of a dancer, and how it's performed is sort of the thing that kind of threads it together.
Also, I think we trying to put boundaries of like definition what is like performance, because when we started studying photography, performance had very like rigid limitations and very rigid definitions. So for us, it's like interesting to see how we can expand actually this terminology, and because like multi-things can be photography and multi-things can be a performance. So we're interested how can we broaden up these definitions.
Great. That might be a good transition into documentation, which we'll also talk about today. What are your experiences with documentation? Is it something that's a part of your routine practice, or is it something new to you, or you're exploring? Do you already document in any way, just like taking photos of your work or videos?
I think for me specifically, it's new. I was trained as an architect, and it was a lot about the final results.
Yeah.
And it was kind of embarrassing to document the process, or it just felt very vulnerable. So it's a new thing to take picture of the unfinished work or the work in progress.
Yeah.
For me, it's the other way, because I have a fine arts background. So obviously documentation is from the beginning.
Right.
Since you do the first sketch, you document.
And whether documentation happens or not can shift the focus of, is this about the process or is this about the result? You know, like with architecture versus fine art or different types of practice. You know, is everything I'm prepping for a final performance, which is for the public, or is it about how do I change as I'm going through this process? Are there any tools that are commonly used for documentation? Or is everyone just kind of muddling through it on their own? Which is fine, that's what we're going to do.
Notion's pretty cool.
Notion, okay. We've been trained in Notion at IMA, just so it's universal and we can share it with each other, but I mean, there's a million different. I'll show you, I'll start with some documentation first. Before I even get into my background. First, I'll start with this. Does anyone recognize this type of art? It's a pretty... Yes, thank you.
I got it.
We've got over here. Great. And I won't keep it dark too long. I don't like to feel like we're in a... Lectures are boring, so I want to have a conversation. But does anyone know what type of art this is? Have you seen it before? It's a fairly unique... It's in the world of printmaking. And my undergrad is at the University of Iowa, and I was very, very lucky to work under... her name was Professor Virginia Myers, and she had developed this technique called foil stamping. She came from a printmaking background. And it's using foil, like the really tacky greeting card foil that you see on Christmas cards and birthday cards, and she was able to figure out a way for artists to be able to use it safely with machinery that wasn't the size of a room and, you know, really dangerous, high pressure, high temperature presses. So she had built this heated roller and used hot plates, figured out all these different balances of glue so the foil could adhere to paper, and started experimenting with it. And this was the very first time I took one of these courses. I ended up taking it several summers in a row in the early 2000s. And this was my first experiment. I layered, I think, gold, silver, and like a copper, and then I melted it with alcohol while it was still on the hot plate. So it created this really textured, there's these chemical reactions happening here. There's a pink in there, which wasn't a part of the foil, that was a chemical reaction. And Virginia was my first teacher who said, document. Like you have to document what temperature are you using, what's the mix of the glue, what foils do you use, write down their, their catalog IDs, how long, how long did you heat the plate, what was the temperature of the plate, and I thought, yeah, whatever. It's like, I made it, of course I'm gonna remember like how this is made. And I made this, and this is one of my favorite pieces of all the pieces I've done. I did this technique for maybe 15, 20 years, and I never was able to recreate it. And so this is like a sad, sad story of no documentation. I tried, I bought the same foils, I got a hot plate, all that, and I was never able to recreate this. So I have the original piece, but there's no way I can recreate it. On the flip side, at the same time, so I started making music in 1995, and I bought a drum machine, and something in me, I don't know if there was no way to back things up or what it was, but something in me said I should write down all the positions of the knobs and the sliders. So I've got, we can look at, this is a map of my mixer. It was a 4-track. I write down what the inputs are. So this is the drum machine, the main output for M. One was independent out 1. This is my sampler, which was an Akai, and this was the 3rd output of my drum machine. I've got the gain, FX1, FX2, treble, mids, lows, and then volumes. And I've got the different effects pedals I was using. So like the worm was a phaser, and so I've got where the knob positions are. And I've got the route, so this goes into this, goes into this, goes into this, and back to this, and back to the mixer. I did that, and 25 years later, I wanted to reconnect all my old gear and do layered versions of it. I wanted to do separations because I learned a lot more about audio mixing and wanted to do clean versions of it. I plugged in all my old gear. I turned all the knobs, I did the cables in the way that it specifies. Essentially, it's a schematic, like a lo-fi schematic, and it sounded exactly the same. And so to be able to document means if I need to recreate that piece of work for any reason, I'm much better equipped to do that. And another form of documentation I'll talk about, so my main work the last, since like 2018, is I do work with EEG headsets. And so I put on an EEG headset and I take my brainwaves and I make music from my mental states or thoughts or directly from my mind. So it reads the electricity in my mind, I convert it to MIDI and make soundscapes or compositions. And the way this started was from this lucid dream. And so the thing I do that's a form of documentation is journaling. When I was 17, there was a friend I had a crush on, and she said, I'm gonna start journaling. And I was like, well, I'm gonna journal too. I don't know if she ever journaled, but that got me started. And so I've journaled since then. I've got all these, paper journals and documented, my late teens through my 20s. And I switched over to digital just because I travel a lot. It's easier to type than write it out. And this was a dream I had late in 2017. A lot of this is really wildly, what's a term for predicting the future in your mind?
Clairvoyance or something.
Clairvoyance, yeah, it was oddly clairvoyant because it has to do with, I had no connection to NYU at the time. Anyway, so it was about having this dream where I had this idea to make I'd made a mixtape. I mean, it's right there, but I'll give the synopsis. I'd made a mixtape. I wanted to impress this reviewer, and she was totally unimpressed with it. And she happened to be, I think, was it a biologist? Yeah. So she was a biologist, and I was thinking, how can I make music to make this very specific reviewer happy? This is all in the dream. None of this is real. And I thought, well, what if I make a whole album based on my DNA sequences? And as a concept, somehow convert my DNA into music. And I woke up and I did a Google search for DNA, and I went to the National Institute of Health website, which is the US government agency for health, and found all these DNA sequences, and they look like musical notes. You know, it was the human genome. And right at the top of it, of the screen, it said primary assembly, which is a DNA term. And any musicians here, electronic music or bands? Okay. If you're a musician or performer who's looking for a name, it's really hard to like come up with names. Like they're all taken. Like all the URLs are taken. For whatever reason, primary assembly, I was like, that's a great techno name. And the URL was available, like everything was available. And so that became the project name. So I didn't find that. Like the dream led me to this thing, which led to this project. And I started exploring with DNA sequences and made music. And then I saw, I found an EEG headband. And I thought, what if I make music live from brainwaves instead of, you know, hard coding DNA sequences? And that's how the project started. So that's directly from documentation. Because if I hadn't written down this dream, I would have thought about making music in this way. I would have gotten to, so my whole career is based on documenting this one dream. You know, it was a vivid dream, but I would have forgotten it. You know, it's as we shift from, so I've gotten a bit in a neuroscience sense. So when we're dreaming, we're down in like delta and theta. They're very slow brainwave states. And as you wake up, you get back into beta, and it's just a different memory set. So sometimes I kind of remember my dreams from last night when I'm going to sleep, like tonight. But in general, it's like I have to like drag those ideas into consciousness and document them. Any questions about this so far?
Just curiosity.
Did you have a question?
No, just curiosity.
Oh, just curiosity. Oh, great.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because for some folks that are unfamiliar with EEG technology,
Yeah.
could you explain that a bit more?
Definitely. So an EEG is something that goes in your head. So there's headband versions, there's like caps, there's things that are more lab. They kind of look like swimmer mat, like that protect your hair, that keep your hair dry, the little swimmer
The swimmer cap.
cap, yeah, the stretchy cap, with all these ports, and then these wires use a gel, and what it does is, and the more commercial versions are just simply electrodes with no gel. But it's an electro, so EEG, electro, encephalography. So encello means it's a layer, the top layer of the brain. And it's about, and then graphy is reading data from, or documenting, like photograph or encephalograph. So what it does is it graphs the data, it detects the data that comes off the electrical energy that's coming off the brain. And what you can do is you can analyze those signals and break it down into what are called brain waves, which are just frequencies in a big spectrum. Almost looks like an audio spectrum if you've seen like an audio and analyzer or an old stereo when it's playing. You see like the bass and then you see the mids and the highs. Same technology. So it reads the different frequencies of your brainwave activity, and those different brainwaves tend to correlate with different mental states. So if we were all to sit and meditate for 5 minutes, our alpha waves would go up. Even just by closing your eyes, your alpha waves go up. Right now, we're mostly, our beta is going to be strongest because talking, engaging, looking at each other, think of processing what you're hearing and think of things to say. If you're dead asleep, you're down delta. It's just body and brain repair. It's a very slow wave. And theta is a very dreamy state. So it's delta, theta, alpha is that meditative state, then beta is active, and then gamma is the fastest frequencies. And gamma is states of intuition or joy or compassion for others. So they're kind of higher states of consciousness. Each state, if it gets too amplified, it can also have bad effects. So it's not that, the more alpha the better or the more gamma the better. People who are schizophrenic have very high gamma and become very externally focused to the point where they read meaning into things that aren't necessarily there. So if my gamma were really high and I was schizophrenic, I might count the number of posters and think that number has something to do with someone plotting against me. So that's like gamma, imbalance. And then too low of a state can be problematic as well. Any other questions about EEG or brainwaves? I just realized I was about to talk about it for like another 30 minutes, but that's not what today's about. Okay. I want to talk about performance and the different reasons why I performed. And so, we can see that. So that's me in probably, I think 99. And I made music to survive emotionally. I was a teenager. I came from a family that had mental illness and alcoholism, and I had a lot of feelings I didn't know what to do with. And the thing that really saved me was taking those feelings and putting it into something constructive, like music. And so I was producing a version of hardcore. It was called breakcore. So if you took drum and bass and hardcore and mashed it together, you get breakcore. It was very niche, very small shows, but it was very popular in this little niche. And
Yeah, okay. You usually use the...
Sometimes that's
It's
complicated.
I think my computer went to sleep, which I'll tell it to stop going to sleep. Battery and okay, that's what's going on. Where's the volume?
It's the knob,
The one on top.
The one. Okay. There we go. I'll just play this for a minute so you can get a sense of. So that's the style. It was like heavy drums, heavy snares, dark, different types of atmospheres that are foreboding. And so I was taking these feelings inside me and putting it into the music. And the performances themselves, in many ways, I didn't interact with the audience. It was more about my relationship to the music equipment. I was so focused on the equipment, and then people were witnessing me having this type of symbiosis with the technology. Other DJs or performers are much more engaged with the audience in terms of reading the audience and getting a sense of what track do I play. For me, it was like, no, this is an emotional experience that I'm having. I'm expressing something, and I'm not catering to an audience, which isn't a super successful model for like getting booked a lot, but the point of this music was expressing emotion. Do people here, is that something that motivates you in terms of you're just trying to express a feeling? It's not about whether it lands in a certain way. I'm seeing some nods. Do you want to talk about just an example of something you do that?
As a student right now, I'm learning to make visuals, and a lot of times I'm just learning to use the software to create a certain effect, and I'm not even planning to show my works to anyone, but I'm like, what do I want to feel through this, or what do I want it to make me feel? Maybe I choose a song that inspires me and think of how that song would look if it was visual instead of sound, and just let it be that, and if I end up liking it, I might share it. If not, it's still from me. It's still my influence.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think I have a similar story than you, because I started like when I was 14, 15, my twin brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So the only way I could actually express the way I was feeling is to write. So I kept writing, kind of like, it wasn't poetry, but like poetic verse kind of. So I just wrote it for me. I didn't share with anyone. But with time, when I was more detached from it, then I started sharing. And obviously because I was doing it for me and for other people, people actually saw the pureness, is that a word?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Pureness that it
Yeah.
had, because I wasn't really caring about
Right.
it.
Yep.
Yeah. In the same, I think with dance, when you want to represent something for the outside, if you don't feel it, it will not land. How you wish, and writing and anything. And I think it's a very interior issue that you need to deal with. You need to prepare yourself to, if you want to show suffering, you will suffer, and maybe you will end up crying in the end of the writing, performance, or anything.
Yeah.
And yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I think I have like a different approach, maybe not, but I like to be more conscious about the present and how can I affect and transform reality the way I see it. Like, how can I, for example, I meditate, and like I meditate in order to get present, like to be more connected with people and like what they are giving to me, what I can give them, and like to be my performativity in life. It's like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see performance.
Yeah.
More than expressing myself. Like I somehow I will express myself. But
But that's not the goal.
it's not.
It's
the
just
final
the overflowing of a process.
But I think that more or less is what Eva and also Antonia and also me were kind of saying, because, for example, Eva was representing something that happened to her brother, and Antonia is trying to represent something that someone created sound-wise and trying to feel it and interiorize it and then export it. So I think, as well as dance, like you can feel what's happening with the sound as well and create it.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's
Maybe
what
a
you said.
little
If you don't feel pain, how are you going to show it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's going to be that impactful.
I don't know that. You can make a list of the attributes that as a society we connect to pain and then kind of create a recipe for it.
Exactly.
But it would be much easier to let your own gut guide you through it and maybe more effective.
I mean, we don't all have the same reasons, but I believe that we all share the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Not the reasons, but the internal things. Kind of like happiness. We all feel happiness, but maybe I'm happy because A, she's happy because B.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, we feel the same.
On one end of the spectrum, you've got art that's made purely from a type of lived experience or pain or feeling. That performance comes from that. And then the other side of the spectrum, I did advertising work for years, which is completely manufactured of like, let's just try to break this down into a formula and create the sound and the motion, the colors to try to evoke that feeling. And a lot of times when making a piece, maybe I started at a point of pain and then 6 months later I'm still working on it and I don't feel that pain. So it's a negotiation between that raw moment and then going through the task to build the thing or to prepare or to write or to draw it out or paint it or choreograph it. And that comes from practice skill. So there's usually a negotiation between, because if I'm in so much pain all the time, I might not be able to just function and get the work done. But it can be such a powerful seed in that moment, and some of my best work
And it will be
has come from
just
those seeds.
catharsis, like
Yeah.
you're feeling pain, like the whole process.
Yeah.
Like, it will turn like into a catharsis only.
Right. Yeah. And there's times where there was experience I had where I did these drawings as my dad got really sick, he was in the ICU for about a week and a half. And so each morning I took a piece of paper and I think it was a real soft graphite and just colored these really dark images. And it was just cathartic. I wasn't for anything except to emotionally survive that day, just to channel everything into the paper, and then I could go to the hospital and show up for him. Those pages are so powerful, because there was no intended audience in a way. And that's kind of on that spectrum of like pure art, I'm doing this art or performance just to express something, pure self-expression. There's nothing technical or product-oriented or engineering-oriented. And particularly if you're working with technology, you might be somewhere in between those. Even some like a camera's technology. Did I see someone that wanted to share something? And then, Nuff, could I ask you to text Ada? And I mentioned another person was going to join us today. She's probably texting me, and I'm not going to look at my phone. Yes.
I have a lot of thoughts about everything being said right now.
Please.
One that is quite simple is like, for me, I think that there's something that exists in the middle of this, like emotional art and like formulaic advertisement type art, but narrative. And I feel like a lot of work that I do lives in the narrative, where like even sometimes it's not even about me. Sometimes I'm doing research on something and I'm learning about a topic and I'm trying to convey that through other mediums besides just academia and papers and writing. So yeah, I think that like there is also that realm that we maybe haven't really discussed. The other thing is like, I have these emotional responses to talking about like, you have to suffer to make good art, because it's like, no. And also like an example I always think about, and I don't think anyone's saying that, but I just think it bears mentioning.
Sure, yeah, it's very valuable.
I remember having a professor once, we were reading Virginia Woolf, and she had bipolar disorder. And he made a really clear point to say that she never wrote when she was depressive or manic. She had to write when she was clear-headed, which wasn't all the time. And sometimes I think artists get put in this rather toxic place where they feel like they have to be suffering to make good art, and then you start beating yourself up and you end up, and like, of course, good things can come from this really important place of like grief and suffering, etc. But yeah, I'm trying to move beyond personally romanticizing sadness, and I think we should all just be wary of that.
Yeah,
That's
no,
great.
it's actually something that we discussed, some of us, a lot, because suffering is very romanticized, but not for me. Like I'm the best of myself when I'm happy, and I think that it's really good to explore the bright side of things, and when you have a clear mind. And I think what you said is so. I agree 100% on that.
Yeah, and like you said, like I don't like the version I am when I'm suffering. But I like the version I am when I'm happy and joyful. And we obviously need both in life. Like if everything is joyful, nothing is joyful, and vice versa. But yeah, duality and balance.
But yes, all these states of mind like connects you to the final work or something, because you're like,
it's all coming.
Like in the narrative, like you're, for example, writing, then correcting, then writing again, correcting and editing. Like you're always like kind of building a palimpsest of state of minds, or I don't know, like
Palimpsest state of mind. Cool.
I like that.
Great.
Those are great points. I'm a huge fan of mental health. There's been times where particularly when I was younger, I was suffering a lot, and it was hard to do anything. So you can't do art if I'm in bed all day, or if I'm completely racked with anxiety. And life itself is going to have its own ups and downs. So even in optimal mental health, there's plenty of inspiration for grief or joy, or all the feelings are there. So thank you for bringing that up, particularly about Virginia Woolf.
Another cool therapy point is that I'm remembering something a therapist told me once, but like to experience, like all emotions are equal. Like we always talk about having these tools to deal with negative emotions, but you can practice them with positive emotions. And that said, like you can also use art and things to convey both of those things, because they're both emotions of the same level and importance.
Absolutely.
I changed it.
No, that's great. It's inspiring.
I feel that Caro brought it together really beautifully, because it sometimes like I do write like everything I'm feeling when I feel bad, but then like a brighter self can view it in a different way than when I was seeing it just in that state and not being able to actually do anything in that moment and take it into something else. So that's why I think it's important to keep those ideas, because sometimes something bigger can grow out of that when you're in a different
And I think also the creative process can be so useful in getting from one emotional state to another, also, or morphing what you feel into something else. Like a while ago, we were talking about creating something from a place of pain, and then some point down the road having to commodify it in some way or something. But even that process can, when it separates you from the pain, can kind of morph the feeling. I think it's very healing.
So related to all those thoughts, Jason.
Trying to see if I can find that drawing series I did.
Related to all those thoughts, Jason, how many years has meditation and journaling been part of your practice? And then we can.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I'm glad you brought up meditation too. That really helps me be present in a way where I detach from the daily stresses and kind of find my own voice again. I started meditating in '96.
That's 27 years. I've been.
Yeah, so I grew up in Iowa, just like a kind of a working class industrial town. But near us, an hour and a half to the south, was a big Transcendental Meditation University. And so I ended up going to raves and techno parties with some of these kids that had grown up in this town. When we were all in high school, we met. And I didn't learn TM directly, but just the concept of it was really intriguing to me. So I began to sit, and one of the best things that I learned early on about meditation is if I just sit and think about my day and like the groceries I have to get later or whatever, that's fine. Like I don't have to have a clear mind. Just the act of sitting, particularly now when it's like so easy to get distracted and like jump on a phone or take a note or something. Just sitting and when I'm really stressed out, like last year, my meditation practice suffered quite a bit in grad school, which isn't an ideal time to like, get more stressed. But what I would do is I'd meditate for 3 minutes or 2 minutes. Instead of being like, oh, I can't meditate for 20, so I'm not going to do it. It's like 2's better than 0. I'll move to the next thing with performance. 2005, 2011, I got into film scoring. So it was a different type of thinking. It was a different type of performance where it wasn't me on stage, and it was a type of synesthesia. I would see film footage, and my brain would start to film the music. And at that point, I had enough skills with the software and the hardware of electronic music to make the sounds that were in my head. So that's part of that skill that in the moment, I don't have to be feeling something. I just need the skill to be able to render what that feeling was. This was one of my favorite pieces. It showed at the Berlin Independent Film Festival, I think 2016. It's a couple minutes long. Any reactions to that as a performance? In terms of what types of mediums or expressions in the performance you saw? Or just reactions? I heard
And I was wondering what the order was of things, like film, and then you, from that you make the sounds, because for me it was so interconnected, like it was happening. I was wondering like if the sounds were created by the leather and the hair, or if it was like outside of the person being filmed at the time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I like to celebrate with this piece is that the budget was the makeup. That's it. So in terms of, it was like $60 budget for the whole thing. I was on an iPhone, early iPhone. I shot in slow motion, so there's a ton of, the files are huge, but there's a ton of frames to work with. I was in the back room of a secondhand shop in Chinatown in LA. So a friend had this secondhand shop with all these cool costumes. I was with my friend Lisa, who's a dancer. So just an incredibly like theatrical type of, she called it masking, if anyone's familiar with that. I'm not really familiar with that, but it's a type of, I think different masks create different identities and then you can act in different ways. And so she had created these, the outfit that you saw. And a lot of time I was just up on a ladder, you know, with an iPhone. I think I had a stabilizer, maybe not, like a cheap one, and just followed her movement. And it was all improv. So even though the final piece is something that's edited and more of not a performance, but you know, a fixed work, what I captured was a performance. So she was just doing this improv work. Nothing was scripted. You know, when I work with people, I really want them to do what they're good at and not manage them at all. And so what I try to do is try to create the space that they need that supports them. We'll see more of this in the next example. And then they have as much fun or joy or expression as they want. So I set up the container and then they perform. And so she did this movement, and even as I'm filming, I was like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. You know, just the way she was able to fold her body and move with that leather and the different outfits. Recorded no sound, so there was no sound recording. It was all just visual footage. Next step was I assembled all these clips into the most vague and darkest, which where it starts, and then slowly categorized them into images that showed more. So I wanted to be this reveal from kind of a deep dream to finally seeing her and seeing her eyes and the tear and the hyper real detail of her face, and then got into scoring it and finding sounds that sounded like movement. And this was the beginning of my work of taking things that are biological or physical and translating that into sound. And so this film was a big step towards that. So I didn't treat it so much like a score. It wasn't like, what's the music of this? But what is her movement sound like in this space with this lighting, with this makeup, with this mask? Does that help explain the process? Great. Yeah, please.
Explain why did you name it Fever? I was just curious.
Yeah, I realized I ended on the title frame. It felt like a fever dream, you know. So in the beginning, it's this, you know, the kind of the visions that can happen in a fever dream, and it feels like it's working through these emotions in this dark space, and more light is coming in on it. And so it moves up and up and up, and finally it's full light and clarity, and it's like the fever broke. So it was fascinated with Carly Brown and looking at dreams and working through deep emotional conflicts through dreams.
Yeah, so I had a question while watching it, and it
Yeah.
kind of morphed after hearing you talk as well as seeing the title slide. While watching it, my assumption was that you worked only on the sound, but clearly you've also shot and directed it.
Yeah.
Which was bringing me to this question of when you work on someone else's vision, how much are you put in a box? You know, this what we were talking about earlier with having creative freedom versus this commodification, etc.
Yeah.
But then that question kind of morphs as to where do you, like, since it's something that you shot and then you also work on the sound, how are these two things kind of driving each other?
Mm-hmm.
And where do you let yourself kind of creatively run with it, but where do you kind of hold yourself back or pull yourself back and be like, no, this is the driving force? Because I feel like when you're doing different things, you can get pulled in different directions.
Agreed.
So how does that synergy work?
I'll answer the first part first, which was what I heard was working with collaborators and how's that different than filming it myself?
Mm-hmm.
It really depends on the partner. So there were some, I scored some indie films and some horror films, which were fascinating because horror relies on sound so much. I mean, you can have a picture of a sunny day in a nice looking house, but if you hear this dreadful music, you're like, something terrible is about to happen. Mm-hmm. But it's just a pretty picture of a house, you know?
Yeah.
So it's really turning the emotional dials. I had directors I worked with that were very specific. I want this, I want this, I want this. And it wasn't as enjoyable. And then other ones, I think particularly ones that were just starting up and maybe weren't clear on what they wanted, but liked my work and hired me because they liked my existing work. And their only direction for that score was, we would like all of the score and all the sounds that you can't tell what instrument made it. I was like, that is a cool challenge. That is a really interesting creative constraint. And so I really dove deep into effects and using guitars in really strange ways and synths in really strange, just to make it as unrecognizable as possible to create this score. So it depends on the partner, and given a constraint like that, that helped me. So it wasn't just about feeling limited, but given a direction that was inspirational to me. So it can really vary based on the partner. In terms of switching roles in the same piece, I think it would be even harder if I was performing as well, you know, if I was dancing. So having Lisa do that was really helpful.
But you are performing somehow as well, like.
I mean, I'm like with the camera. So in a way, trying to capture this art phenomenon that was unfolding in front of me, and what angle and what lighting do I want to capture that with? So that is a performance, absolutely.
And the lighting, did you do it in the moment or following her?
We just had like bright lamps,
Okay.
like totally very low budget. Yeah, everything about this was low
No,
budget.
because with the editing, it works really well with the movements.
Yeah, absolutely. It was some trial and error, but it came together really, really well. And I think working with someone that you trust a lot and creating a space where they can do their thing is really important. In terms of shifting roles, it was a film first rather than a music piece. So like a music video, everything is going to prioritized around the music.
Mm-hmm.
And the video is just there to accent identity. This is another classmate of mine from IMA. Welcome. Whereas this was a film, so I knew the sound had to be in a supporting role to the image. And that's where the priorities come. It can be hard to work on both at the same time, even figuring out what the editing sequence is. And so with this one, it made sense to edit, at least get a rough cut of the film first, and then start placing sounds in and realizing the timing might be different with the sound, and then going back and forth. So there's a little bit of reconciliation as you go back and forth. Similar to that word is used in between the Senate and the House of Representatives in the U.S., where they have the same bill that they're trying to pass, and they kind of go back and forth. That reconciliation process of film, music. Any other questions about this piece? I have another motion. Yeah.
I have
Yeah,
a
please.
question. Was the dancer, like during the filming, I know that you didn't capture any audio, any sound, but was the dancer following any specific sound? Was there any music or environment created, or was just like silence?
Yeah, just in the background. I mean, word sounds from like the store. Yeah, so it was, she's extremely talented. And so we had this idea, and a lot of it was something that was birthed between us. So I didn't go to her and say, hey, I've got this vision, let's do this thing, let's find these costumes that look like this. It was us both going to the secondhand store, meeting with the owner, and her being like, oh, I've got this cool thing, and seeing what we gravitate towards. And it's finding where the excitement is. Because if there's excitement there, that becomes the fuel that can get you through, you know, a 3-month editing process or, you know, filming. So we looked for that spark, we looked for that gumption or that muse. And I had seen her do movement work before. And so my direction to her was, you're the director. You know, so move as you want. And I think I showed her some footage in between, you know, we took some breaks, and so she could see how her movement looked. And I was so excited about it as well. And then we would mess with the lighting a little bit, and then there's, I think, 2 costumes here, one that red leather and then that hood at the end. So it was more of a conversation, and a conversation where, like, you know, I'm gonna have lunch with a friend later. I have no idea what we're gonna talk about. That's not the point. The point is that I like her. I want to talk to her. I want to hear how her day is. She wants to hear how mine is. So it's just a very vague thing, and then the conversation happens, and that's how the art is formed. So that conversation. Yeah.
I just have one question. I don't know if the feeling that I felt was necessarily like what I would feel in a horror movie, but there was a point in the film where I was like, is something that
I know.
Yeah, I'm just wondering like how you got to that tension moment, or how you envisioned that, or if I was like, it was just me being paranoid, or if that was like.
Do you remember what moment it was?
Almost at the end.
Do you want to revisit it? Before I like rewind?
Yeah, when her hair, you can see part of her hair very shadowy, and then she's disappearing. I think that was hard. That is the part of the sound.
So I literally used some of the sounds, thank you, from horror films that I scored. So kind of there's like breath sounds, there's crinkling sounds. So all of a sudden her hair, and I think I flipped the footage in that, so it's reversed. And so the movement is strange. So normally you're like this, and all of a sudden you go like this, and then the hair moves. So it's disorienting in different ways.
If it was a horror movie, her face would have just like
Exactly.
popped out. Yeah.
And that's part of the reveal is you haven't seen her face yet. So if in the first shot you saw her face,
It wouldn't be. We would know like, oh, it's a beautiful girl. Like, but
Right.
here we're like, what is this?
you have no idea what's in that shadow. And that's that idea of fever, of starting in this kind of disoriented place and then slowly going to a reveal. So a lot of techniques with texture, pitch and tone. So there's some very dark, bassy sounds that can evoke a sense of dread. There's a field of psychoacoustics, of how do sounds impact our minds and biology based on not our training of, last few hundred years where we're in cities, but we've spent most of our existence as humans in nature. So if you hear a deep sound like that, it means it's like a huge animal or an earthquake or a thunderstorm, and it means take cover. And so we still have those receptors in us in terms of psychoacoustics. So that's something you can play with those deep tones. And it doesn't make sense because she's just a small person, you know, she's not this like elephant or whale or, you know, large animal. And why is that bass playing? In the brain trying to reconcile that. And then when it's dark, using light as a way to create a performative narrative where, again, if the reveal had happened at the beginning, it's just like, oh, this is a nice person, they're having a tough moment. Or is this person somehow a threat? Because I don't have enough information yet. And so it's working with the information that the brain has in a moment to create an experience. And for anyone who's done film or performances, particularly repeatedly, it can be hard to remember what's like for someone who's never seen it before. You know, so if you've edited things or rehearsed something, you know, dozens or hundreds of times, that's a real skill. And sometimes it takes just performing it in front of or playing a song in front of someone who's never heard it, and all of a sudden I hear it with new ears. You know, I don't hear it in the old way that I'm used to in my studio where it's on loop. So that's a real powerful thing, is showing it to someone new and be like, oh, okay, that's the moment. Or let's build the tension or reduce the tension here or there. How are we on time?
How much time do you have?
I'm yours as long as you want me.
20.
Great. Any other questions about this piece before I move to, it's another motion piece, which I think will be interesting. So coming from that film, the film itself is edited, you know, it's fixed. Let's keep that one on for a second. I'll explain and then I'll, thanks. It was a predecessor to this, which is, can I sonify movement in real time rather than being a film? Because like I said, I wasn't recording, nothing was playing acoustically in that film. That was me on my computer later editing, grabbing sounds. And so can that experience of seeing that film, is that something that can happen live? You know, where a dancer's movement is sonified. And so I started working with dancers and motion sensors. I'd met with one from Berlin. We were at a wedding together in 2016. I had been working on some generative algorithms for music. She had worked with motion sensors where her movement controlled light. And she said, what I really want is to be able to control sound. And because I created these sequencers and deconstructed sounds, I was like, oh, I could take my system and put it with this idea of motion sensors and light. So started working with motion sensors, and with each dancer, it's a unique relationship. So there's not a formula of I've got these sounds that work with every dancer I work with. I meet with a dancer and I find what sounds are intriguing to them. If they imagine their movement convert into sound, what does that sound like? So for some dancers, it sounded like city sounds and different types of like spoons and metal and conflict and, you know, just these impacts. And then this is a dancer named Ty Wells from Los Angeles. And he really liked this idea of like human sounds. And so we just took a recorder and he would like hit his chest and make these guttural sounds with his throat and different vocals, slaps and hits. And we recorded all those. And then he wanted to see if those could be turned into like a machine. So he's losing his humanity, just being crunched up by something mechanical. And so I had these different soundscapes that I had sampled that were very mechanical. And so we slowly go from something organic and move into, and as that soundscape is changing, it's being composed by him. So you'll see that he has a motion sensor on one wrist and one ankle. And as those move at different velocities, they trigger these sounds. And when it triggers a sound, one of the things to keep things dynamic, instead of it triggering, you know, if I do this and it triggers each time, after a while that gets repetitive, like But if it triggers one of many samples that have that feeling, it feels, so it's like, so it's the same type of feeling, but it doesn't feel so robotic or repetitive. So that's how it was set up, was velocity, doing triggers. Let's see Ty's work. All right, now I'll get the. Ta-da. I swear I'm good at tech. Any reactions to that as a performance or questions that come up? I can give more details about the process, but I want to hear from you first.
While the process of the creating this piece, has it been a topic that has live sound performance has been a topic? Like, so right now it's all programmed, right? I don't know.
Live performance mean like a band?
No, just like maybe you manipulating some of the data, some of the sounds that was already coming from the performer. Has there been like a discussion around that, or was it just like, let's program the system and then let the performer do it?
There was some back and forth in that I was making the decision of, I was watching him.
Uh-huh.
This was a new role for me because I wasn't on stage.
Yeah.
And so I'm more of a facilitator. I'm helping create this space where he can be as expressive and powerful as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But there was some, what would the role be? It's not director, but kind of a mix between a director and a sound tech, where I was making some decisions of when to transform the sounds from the human sounds to the mechanical sounds. It was a crossfader on a octatrack. And as I was fading that, this whole thing is a relationship between him and me and the sounds and the technology system all together in moment to moment. So as he's moving, he's hearing his own sounds sonified. It's triggering these sounds that he's chosen. And he's also, I mean, you can see it in the footage, he's playing, you can see his brain learning when I do this or I do this. We had a few rehearsals, but all of them were improv. You know, like none of this was a scripted, this was him being dropped into this, I call them generative containers. So I create the parameters for the performance and we choose the sounds together and the responsiveness and it's all play. And the final performance is he performs as long as he wants. So it could be, you know, there were times in these systems where the performance was 7 minutes long and that's what felt right based on the crowd in the moment. There's other times where the performances were 25 minutes, you know, based on that day and that moment. And I wanted that type of flexibility, you know, for him to be able to just be as present as possible with the system. So as I'm changing the sound slowly from human to mechanical in that mix, he's hearing that and he's getting different reactions as he's moving. And that then gives him different inspiration. So if I do this and I hear, whew, versus if I do this and I hear, I then like change how I'm reacting to that sound I just made.
Yeah.
And so there is a relationship between him and I. Did that answer it? Great, great.
Actually, I just repeat, like echo a little bit of what you're saying, that I like that you're not thinking of it of like, okay, what sounds are we triggering as we make the movement? But you're saying, how can I create a space that empowers so you're thinking of it spatially rather than triggering just students in the room who are taking notes.
Absolutely. And this, seeing this work was really inspirational for the EG work I did later, because what I saw was his brain and his art was going through a biofeedback experience where he moved and then reacted to the thing he just made. And the dancers that would use this system would feel incredibly powerful because they were always used to dancing to music. And all of a sudden they're the composer. And so as they move, when they want to take a break, the music stops. You know, traditional, you just hit play on the song, it's going to play through wherever you feel or not. So all of a sudden, he had much more embodied power in his movement, and he got to choose when there's a sound, when there's a pause, based on what his body and brain were doing in that moment. And for me, to create a space that empowered someone through biofeedback then was a huge inspiration for the last work I'll show.
Yeah, since you're essentially tailor-making instruments for these dancers to play around with, these generative sandboxes.
Yeah.
As a facilitator of making these instruments, how much do you allow yourself to also be part of that generative sandbox while the performance is going on? Or what's the generative part for you other than purely making it?
And facilitator was the word I was looking for, so thank you.
To the folks that walked in, we have chairs still if you want to join
If you want to come over.
us and be away from the dangerous door that could open at any moment.
Yeah, come on in. This is Ada, who I'll be having lunch with later. It's similar to the role of doing a mix down for a band or musician, and you are the audio engineer. And it can be just purely technical, tell me what to do, and I have the technical skills to manifest your vision. Or it can be this relationship of, well, what do you think of this sound? It's like, oh, let's try this. Oh, let's do a take with this new instrument. And so working with these dancers was very much a collaboration of what sort of ideas I had in terms of what's technically possible, and allowing them to expand their imagination larger and larger based on, usually they would come into it thinking less was possible. And And then with some of the dancers, we would take turns. So, like, I'm an all right dancer. Like, I'm not whatever. But anyway, so I'd put on this and do stuff. And they would get to see what that looks like, the sounds they chose or the movement mappings they chose, and how that looks to them. But for the most part, they would be moving and it would be like, how's this sound feel? And then change the sound. Well, how about this? Or let's try this sound, or let's open and close this filter when you do this movement. So it's this process of figuring out what it's like, mapping the inputs to the outputs, as we've done a lot with interactive media arts, and finding out that sweet spot. I don't think I ever had a situation where there was just a genuine conflict of like, I don't like that sound, and the other person was like, we have to use it. Because it's like if one person's miserable, then there was plenty of agreement on, what the vision was. But in terms of the tone, the dancer chose it. Like, he wanted this human thing and the mechanical thing. So I was letting him know what was possible. So facilitator is a really good term for that. I feel like it took way too long to answer. Anything? Yes?
Well, actually, that's good that went first, because it answered a lot of my questions. But
Okay.
finishing off with did anyone ever, I don't know, if I was in that situation and somebody was like, Laura, what do you think your movement sounds like? I think my response would be, I don't know, you tell me.
Sure.
And I would love that. To me, as a mover, is so much more interesting to me. Has that ever happened? And did that make the process look any different? Or was it like every dancer was really wanting to take the reins on that?
I think because dancers traditionally aren't choosing the music, that it was a new role for them to step in and start exploring. So it was a process of laying the tools out in front of them and seeing where their curiosity got piqued. And then they started making choices of like, oh, I can choose.
Yeah.
So it was a new role for them. And the ones I worked with embraced it very well. Another piece I did, an artist wanted to construct sentences through his movement.
Yeah.
And so he chose all these different passages. We had a computer voice read them. He specifically wanted a computer voice, chop them up, and we chose what sounds would trigger which words. And then also I found the root note of each word and would have tones play, so I could crossfade between sentences and music from the tones of those sentences. So it's this nice back and forth of bringing musicality to these, kind of like if you had a poem, you chopped it up, you threw it up in the air, and it landed, reconstructing it. So that was the effect. Yeah.
First of all, this is incredibly powerful, I think.
Thank you.
The collaboration of movement and sound. I have two questions. One is purely technical, which is from the motion sensor, how much information were you getting? Was it just an accelerometer where movement, no movement? Or were you getting like X, Y, Z, motion, etc.? First question. Second question is, of course, you did mention that you had a few rehearsals and most of it was improvisation.
Yeah.
But preceding that, how long did it take, you guys working individually and also together to come to a place where both parties were kind of happy with then going out and improvising and having that faith and trust in each other?
That's a great question. I'll start with the first question. Technically, what's coming off of those wristbands, they were Myo wristbands, M-Y-O. They no longer make them, so next time I do this, I'll probably use a Move Sense, which are these little discs and straps that have more flexibility because it could go on the arm or the torso or the head, whereas these wristbands only could fit on the ankle or wrist. XYZ accelerometer data, so you could get spatial, and also had a gyroscope, so you could do twist. I wasn't using twist with this, but in later performances, we had twist where you could open or close a filter with movement or change a volume of a sound or combine the two to create a different effect, and then also have velocity-based movement. And that was Bluetooth over to an iPhone or a computer. And then I created an application that would process that data and output the MIDI over to either Ableton or Octatrack or a drum machine. Can you remind me the second question?
Yeah. The second question was more about how long did it
How long
take?
did it
or-
take? Yep. It was very fast, and this is where I really started to see the power of biofeedback. Because there wasn't a script or memorization, it was just about his body and brain rewiring, and because it's pleasurable, it happened super fast. And so this footage isn't the final show. This was, I'll be realistic, this was the second rehearsal. Yeah. So we did one rehearsal. We met, chose sounds, recorded sounds. I built the system. And we had one rehearsal at an apartment in LA. And I have footage of it, but it's not lit. It wasn't meant for a performance. And that's where we chose the sounds. And so this was our first time going into a space. I'd seen him move and was blown away by it. So I trusted him. He trusted the system. And so this is 10 minutes of initial play. And so a lot of the rewiring in his brain is happening live. You can see these moments where he's like, what does this do? And then what if I do a bigger movement? Like, how does that trigger something? So this is watching the learning happening. And then the final performance, I have footage of that, but it's a big crowd, so it's a little more distracted. So I like using this footage because we're alone in the art space. Yeah.
First of all, I'm very happy that you're showing this, also talking about the dancer side of this collaborative project. And one thing that I was feeling is that probably if you change the sound, the movement will change completely, because the performer is exploring what he's creating. And I think that's very important for someone that is dancing, that they are because if the sound changes, the movement could change. And I saw him really exploring where this could go and what sounds he was provoking with you. And it's actually very interesting because we are working in something like this, me, Cornell, and Alp. And I'm glad that you show this, and you also, because without your sound he couldn't perform. I mean, he could, but then when the sound comes on, it changes completely. Right? So thank you very much.
Yeah. And on the flip side, without him, I couldn't have done this composition. So it introduced this idea. I came from a world of drum machines and quantization and 4/4 beats, and it gets boring, into something that's biomorphic, like the shape of life. It's the shape of movement. So he's composing these sounds in a way that I could never compose on a keyboard or an Ableton. So he's the composer. I just created the notes or the instrument. So it was a really beautiful relationship to be able to both sides.
I think that's a good place for us to begin to process as we reflect on everything Jason's saying. Particularly for my class, you'll remember that we start off with solos. They're asked to do a 1-minute solo, and it's the most terrifying thing for them.
Yes.
Because they have to not use technology. So
That's great.
Make a strong lighting choice in the room. You can have a sound, but it has to emanate from you or your phone, and just incorporate a repetitive action so that we remove ourselves from thinking about technology as a crutch, right? Because oftentimes people say, "Oh, I'm doing a piece. There's 4 projections happening, and there's this immersive sound." Okay, well, what's it about? You didn't tell me anything about what's it about. So we start in the solo. And by the end of the semester, they end with forming collaborations. So it's really amazing to also hear about. I think I'm going to use the vocabulary generative
Containers, yeah.
I love that idea.
Or sandbox, as Pim said. I think that's it also.
And how meaningful that collaboration can be. And also, part of being in new media and interactive media arts is this, it's the feeling, it's the playfulness, it's also the trust in each other as you're devising work. So, are there any final questions? Maybe I could take a group of questions all at once. Oh, no? Maybe the Grammar Collective can talk to Jason.
Yeah, that's
We have a new artist. Cool. As we kind of wrap up, just want to open my notes. Yeah, I think it's really beautiful that you began with also saying that you made music to survive emotionally. And that's, was also you performing, and now also how that translates into you being on the more technical side. So thank you for sharing your process, Jason. It's really, really amazing. Thank you for sharing so much time with us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me
give
here.
you a round of applause.